Good afternoon to you, Mark Sutt of HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Outlook and discussion for Monday, July 11th, 2016. Going to be a lengthy one today, not a lot to talk about in terms of any threat to land, but we do have a few things that I like to look at the start of every week, plus the new segment this week in hurricane history. First of all, the analysis of what is going on, and in the Atlantic, that's a big fat nothing right now over the next 48 hours. And that will extend to the next 5 days as well, believe me when I tell you. And you know that. The Atlantic's nice and quiet for now. I'll show you why in just a moment. Meanwhile, in the eastern Pacific, things continue to remain very busy. Hurricane Celia out here going to move on out away from Mexico still. Yet another system with a 90% chance of development in the next day or so, probably less than that. And if we scroll down and take a look at the 5-day outlook from the National Hurricane Center, not only do we have this system in red, but also this additional area that is forecast to possibly try to get going, but only about a 20% chance. Maybe the proximity of these systems to each other will thwart that development a little bit. We'll see. Bottom line is this region remains very busy right now. Good news is nothing threatening Mexico. Interest in Hawaii, you just want to make sure you're watching these systems with so many of them forming. You never know. I don't see anything in the long term that indicates a specific threat to the Hawaiian Islands, but with all these developments, you certainly want to keep a heads up. Just good advice, and I think it makes sense. All right? So this time of year, the 11th through the 20th of July, moving through the second third of the month, you see in the Atlantic Basin a few more dots here. This is the past development areas over the last century or so. Subtropical Atlantic development, pretty prolific. And then the Caribbean and Gulf seem to kind of shut down July, a pretty inactive month in the tropics, as you well know. Meanwhile, the Southeast Pacific stays busy, so at least we are not breaking precedents by what's happening this week and last week cumulatively, adding up to be a very busy time in the Eastern Pacific, as it should be. Moving on along to the sea surface temperature anomalies. Check it out. This is the cold anomaly showing up in the equatorial Pacific, and it is strengthening, not quite to La Nina levels, but definitely getting more enhanced. And you can also see in here just a little bit of this erosion of the warm anomalies in the eastern Pacific. As each one of these systems forms, especially as they become hurricanes, that will take some of the heat out of the eastern Pacific, and that could have some implications on the Atlantic and Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico later on. If you take heat out from here, and this is colder, and then you notice the juxtaposition to the very warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, the western Atlantic, and the Caribbean, this imbalance, if it does indeed develop, and we certainly are getting colder water down here, that contrast could play a big role later on in August and September. You notice also the main development region has not cooled off, still holding fairly warm compared to average, cold up in the subtropics, North Atlantic, etc. So no real major changes. It just seems that the cooler areas are getting cooler, the warmer areas slightly warmer from week to week here. So no big surprises. Everything seems to be pretty much status quo. And looking at the subsurface analysis here in the Pacific, here's all that cold water reaching the surface. A lot of colder water in the subsurface. This is down to about 150 meters deep. And then in the western Pacific, a little bit of a positive anomaly showing up. The La Nina not really taking strong hold yet, but it's getting there. This is certainly a marked change to where we were last year, sea surface temperature and subsurface temperature wise in the equatorial Pacific. So again, no major changes. Everything seems to be moving along as we thought it would. So this is a neat map. I like showing this from time to time. The tropical cyclone heat potential in the Atlantic, of course, nothing out there to take advantage of it, but very high ocean heat content in and around the greater Antilles. And then you have this little snake of warmth here. That's the Gulf Stream showing up with low, but still there, amounts of upper ocean heat content. And again, this is the water temperature 80 degrees or higher, reaching several meters, and in some cases several tens of meters below the surface, so that when something comes along to churn that up. A hurricane, for example, the churning up of the water just churns up more warm water. And the deeper that 80-degree line, or that isotherm as we call it, reaches into the ocean, the more upper ocean heat content there is. So another way to look at that is the Western Caribbean here, with these reds and whites showing up. You can bet that the 80-degree line extends way down into the ocean, so there's a lot of deep, warm ocean water, much like what you would see in the Western Pacific right now, showing up in parts of the Atlantic Basin. Not an issue now, but eventually something's going to come along and take advantage of that, and we will analyze that when the time comes. Looking at the actual sea surface temperatures in areas along the mid-Atlantic, finally water temperatures reaching 78, 79, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The Chesapeake Bay getting nice and warm. And then the Gulf Stream, you can see clearly outlined here. Areas south of there, down along the Carolina coast, water temperatures in the low to mid-80s in some cases, 28, 29 degrees Celsius, and even 30 degrees Celsius reaching here along the shelf water of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida. It's typically not real warm right down here along the north coast of Florida, but the way that the profile of the western Atlantic has been this year and the wind setup, yeah, it's very warm all the way to the coast. Looking in the Gulf of Mexico, now this is interesting. Let me zoom back out. You have this huge area of 30 degrees Celsius plus, and then this other area behind it, south and west of it, of lower water temperatures. It's, you don't have this bleeding over like this. It's just interesting how it's like it's broken up into two different large sections. I don't really know how to explain that, but you have this line of demarcation here between 29C and 30C water. Doesn't really matter. It's just interesting to see that the pattern shaped up that way on this week's analysis here from the NOAA NESDIS site. Zooming in, you can see, boy, I tell you, if you wanted to go into the Gulf of Mexico on the west coast of Florida, I don't know that it would cool you off that much. 31 and 32 degrees Celsius. We're talking about upper 80s to almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is also the case in and around the waters just off of the central Gulf Coast. Lots of fuel for hurricanes, that's for sure. Not very cool if you go into the water trying to seek relief from the heat that has been so oppressive. So this is a really cool animation from the University of Wisconsin. The total precipitable water, and a few things that I can point out to you. Basically, the deep reds that you see would be a tremendous amount of precipitable water in the atmosphere available to be wrung out if there's a triggering mechanism. Lots and lots of that over here around the Asian continent, China, down towards Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, etc. Kind of generally refer to this as the maritime continent region. Lots and lots of moisture available there. Then you notice, coming off of Africa, this dry air in the mid-levels, very prominent in the blue, and the teal colors, not as much moisture. But then you see there's this little bit of a bump right here of additional moisture as these tropical waves come off of Africa. Also, you notice very prominently this curling up of some of the moisture plumes. This is what was Bloss, this is Celia, and then another system trying to develop. I mean, basically, this is your favorable area right now. This is not. Mainly because we do have these intrusions of this drier, more stable and dusty air coming off of Africa, and that is pushing across the Atlantic, keeping a cap on things, and you can see that better in the Saharan air layer analysis itself. Look at that, just a very prominent dry area all across the Atlantic basin. One surge of moisture right in here with a tropical wave, but it's not going to have much chance to develop, probably not until it reaches the eastern Pacific. And again, a lot has been made of this. I see on social media and elsewhere that, oh my goodness, the Saharan air is dominant and it's just unbelievable. I mean, it's July. The pressures are high this time of year. This might be a little bit more than I've seen, but there's really, the hottest pinks, and let me outline it in yellow, and reds are up here, farther to the south. And you can look at the scale, right there, that word less. So this is less dry air, and the pinks and reds are more dry air and Saharan air layer. And all this through here is kind of that yellow, and I mean, there's somewhere there's just nothing. So it's not as bad as people make it out to be, and it's a good thing that we're not having hurricane after hurricane, because you see what happens in the western Pacific normally, although this year's been below normal. When there's no Saharan air to choke things out, you get a very busy period, and we think that's coming in August and September. Let's wait for that and be ready for it. When will it happen? Well, the Euro and the the Euro and the GFS at odds with each other again. This is the ECMWF forecast of the MJO over the next 2 weeks or so, out to the 25th of July. And you can see it kind of comes out of the null region, meaning no real discernible MJO activity. And then it kind of hangs a right, if you're looking at it from our perspective, into the Indian Ocean area, starting the MJO cycle over. And that's generally what we would expect. But boy, the GFS says, I am going to take a left at that fork in the road. I guess it depends on how you look at it. If you are on the path, then it would be a right. If whatever. Looking at it from our perspective, this one takes a right, this one takes a left into phases 2 and 1. And I just don't know if this is going to be believable. The Euro seems to have the better handle on things. We'll see. So just more confusion because it's hard to tell from this. But again, being in July, this isn't really surprising. So we'll see what happens. All right, well, that's a look at the tropics. No real problems. Obviously, I've outlined that. So let's take a look at this week in hurricane history. There have been some interesting developments in July that we have added to the history books. And one of those I talked about last week, and it came to fruition making landfall this week, 20 years ago. And actually, this was the very first hurricane that I was out in and professionally documenting it, I guess you could say. I had just started my career about a year before, after graduating college in 1995, the beginning of this new uptick in Atlantic activity. And lo and behold, the very next season we had Hurricane Bertha, formed out here in the deep tropics, weakened considerably, and then got its act together before making landfall around the Cape Fear region on July the 12th, 1996. And here is a satellite picture of it. I was right out here at Wrightsville Beach. Draw a little arrow in there for you. That's where I was. And I had taken a weather station with me right down to the bridge. They had closed the bridge to Wrightsville Beach. This had ramped up to Category 2, had a nice eye trying to develop, very well-defined banding, very heavy convective activity, and really ramped up over the Gulf Stream as the shear relaxed. There was a trough that swung by, left this behind, the shear relaxed, and it really intensified. So there's a picture of me, the very first picture ever taken of me doing what I do now for a living. And I thought this was so neat. This is a Davis anemometer, and no, this is not the best way to measure wind, but for me back then, just out of college, had no money to speak of, just starting my career doing hurricane awareness consulting, etc. And I did have this Davis anemometer, and there's the computer that it runs into, and it's battery powered with a little 9-volt. And so I had pressure readings and wind readings, and it was just something as opposed to nothing. You know what I mean? I wanted to get out and just see what the wind was. Several people took my picture. They thought it was amazing. And I thought, well, why doesn't somebody like the Weather Channel do this? Or any of the news stations? And, to this day, most of them still don't. They might have a Kestrel or something that they hold up. But, now, of course, we have state-of-the-art, incredible, and very expensive weather equipment to do this job without me standing there. That's not very smart in a hurricane, but what did I know back then, right? I certainly know better now. So that's Bertha, and then, of course, just 11 years ago this week, Hurricane Emily, the earliest Category 5 hurricane ever, and it barreled through the Caribbean, coming out of the deep tropics, forming right around this date, July 10th or 11th, and by the 16th, south of Jamaica here, right there at that particular point, it became a Category 5, and this is what it looked like. Very small, compact core, Recon went in and measured, and in the post-analysis, I believe this was upgraded to a Category 5 and went on to make landfall across the Yucatan and then eventually just south of Brownsville, Texas, in part of that historic 2005 hurricane season that brought us 28 total named storms. So there you go, a week in hurricane history. I was part of that 20 years ago, starting out my career 20 years ago tomorrow, Hurricane Bertha. It's on YouTube. I have about a 2-minute clip. So if you're watching this on YouTube, search out Hurricane Bertha, and mine will be in there. I don't know why I didn't post more. Maybe I should go back and look and see if I have more and upload something. Maybe tomorrow, since it's the anniversary. That'll give me something to do today. All right, well, that's it from me for today. Thanks for tuning in on this lengthy look at the tropics and a look back at some hurricane history. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com, and I'll be back with you on Wednesday.